At 11:02 a.m. on D-Day, a young American pilot dove through low clouds over France, bombs-armed flak rising fast. Seconds later, a single mistake turned the sky into a firestorm. This isn't just the story of D-Day. It's the story of how quickly the hunter became the hunted. Seconds after that firestorm in the sky, the truth about D-Day air support became brutally clear. This was not the kind of war Ed McNabb had trained for. Just weeks earlier, his combat log was filled with high-altitude escort missions, long cold flights protecting bombers over Germany. Up there, the world felt distant. You fought other fighters. You calculated angles, lead pursuit, closing speed. It was deadly, but it was clean. Now everything had changed. In May 1944, the entries in his logbook shifted. Dive bombing practice, low-level attack runs, hours spent learning how to point a 9,000-pound Mustang straight at the earth and pull out before it killed you. Operation Overlord was coming, and the 8th Air Force needed more than escorts. It needed hunters flying through flak power lines and smoke. Dive bombing wasn't instinct. It was math timing, nerve, wind drift, release angle, throttle control. And all the while, German gunners waited below, hidden in hedgerows, rail cars, even inside trains, ready to turn the sky into a wall of tracers. There were only weeks to prepare. When the invasion stripes were painted across their wings, black and white bands cutting through polished aluminum, every pilot knew what it meant. No more rehearsals, no more practice dives over English fields. The next time they rolled inverted, it would be over France. The next time they rolled inverted, it was June 6, 1944. Before dawn, Ed McNabb climbed into his Mustang under a sky that still belonged to the night. The engine roared to life at 4:30 a.m., and one by one, the fighters lifted off into layered clouds stacked like wet concrete. Below them, the English coast faded. Ahead, France. They weren't assigned to the beaches themselves. No dramatic strafing runs across Omaha at sunrise. Instead, the 355th Fighter Group was ordered to patrol oval patterns in the dark, flying by time and compass. Through breaks in the clouds, they could see it, a dull orange glow on the horizon. Naval guns hammering the coastline. The invasion had begun. As daylight crept in, the sky filled with aircraft. Mustangs here, Thunderbolts there, bombers overhead. The most dangerous enemy that morning wasn't always German, it was collision. One wrong turn in the clouds, and 2 American fighters could vanish without ever seeing the ground. The first sortie passed with little more than scattered flak, uneventful, almost disappointing. But D-Day was not finished with them. Back in England, crews refueled the Mustangs and bolted bombs beneath their wings, 500 pounds of steel where drop tanks usually hung. This time, they wouldn't be guardians. They would be attackers. At 11 a.m., Ed took off again, now a flight leader. On his wing flew 20-year-old Lieutenant Thomas J. Foster from Mississippi. Just weeks earlier, Foster had scored his first kill. Now he followed a veteran into the thick clouds over France. Their mission was simple in words, brutal in execution. Hit trains, bridges, convoys, anything moving toward the beaches. Starve the German defenses. Buy the men, on the sand, a fighting chance. Low clouds forced them down. Too low. Somewhere beneath that gray ceiling, a lone FW-190 burst from the overcast and ripped past their squadron commander before vanishing again like a shark slipping underwater. a reminder. The sky still belonged to the enemy. Then they saw that a train cutting across the countryside racing toward the coast. Ed rocked his wings and rolled into the dive. Ed rolled inverted nose, slicing down through the gray, the train growing larger in his gun sight with every heartbeat. The Mustang howled as gravity took hold 9,000 pounds of aluminum and fuel diving straight at steel tracks and black smoke. Steady, steady. At the right moment, he punched the release. The 500-pound bomb dropped clean. Ed pulled hard, the G-forces crushing him into the seat as the explosion ripped across the rails below. Behind him, Foster followed. Too close. In the chaos of smoke and speed, the spacing tightened. Both Mustangs strafed the train point, .50 caliber stitching sparks along the cars. Then an impact, a sharp metallic thud through Ed's airframe. He glanced left. Fire. A thin, vicious flame licked out of his wing like a blowtorch. For a split-second time, slowed. Not flak. Not a German fighter. Friendly fire. Foster's tracers had drifted forward during the pass, one round tearing into Ed's wing. Hydraulic fluid ignited instantly. Stay calm. Instead of diving for the deck, Ed did the opposite. He pushed the throttle and clawed for altitude. Higher, higher. If he could starve the flames of oxygen, he might live. Below, France burned. Inside the cockpit, sweat ran into his eyes as the fire danced along the metal skin. No brakes. Damaged systems. If the wing failed, he wouldn't even make the channel. At 20,000 feet, the flame sputtered, then miraculously went out. Ed limped the wounded Mustang back across the water, landing fast and long at RAF Manston, a field meant for broken aircraft and desperate men. The plane rolled endlessly across grass breaks, gone until it finally slowed to a stop. He was alive. But the invasion had only just begun. He was alive. But war doesn't pause for survival. By the time Ed made it back to his squadron, D-Day was already turning into D-Day +1. The beaches were secured, but barely. German armor and reinforcements were moving inland, trying to crush the fragile foothold before it hardened into liberation. At sunrise on June 7th, Ed walked toward a new aircraft. His old P-51B was finished. Waiting for him now was a brand new P-51D bubble canopy, better visibility, 2 extra .50 caliber machine guns. More firepower, more awareness. He would need both. On his wing again, Lieutenant Thomas J. Foster, 20 years old, Mississippi drawl, the same young pilot who had accidentally set his leader's wing on fire the day before. They joked about it briefly. Dark humor, the kind only fighter pilots understand. If you could laugh, you could fly. But the sky over France wasn't interested in jokes. Cloud cover hung low again as they crossed the channel. Below, Allied troops were pushing inland, vulnerable and exposed. Every convoy the Germans moved could mean hundreds of American lives. They spotted it near the coast, a convoy and another train. Ed keyed the mic. Blue flight roll in. He tipped the Mustang over and dove, bomb-armed. Target centered, airspeed screaming past safe numbers. At the precise instant he released, the bombs separated, cleanly tumbling towards steel and fuel below. He pulled up hard, and then he looked back. Foster had followed him into the dive, but something was wrong. Instead of pulling out clean, the young Mustang jerked violently. A flash, a secondary explosion. The ground rushed up to meet him. In one horrifying second, Foster's aircraft rolled inverted and drove straight into the earth. a fireball. Black smoke twisting into the low clouds. It was over before anyone could speak. Later, Ed would believe the blast from his own bomb, or perhaps an ammunition train below, had caught Foster in the shockwave. They had trained for dive bombing, but not enough. Not for this. June 7th would become the worst day of the war for the 355th in pilot losses. And for Ed McNabb, the sky would never look the same again. Vive. And the sky did not get quieter after Foster fell. As Blue Flight climbed away from the burning wreck, the radio erupted with frantic calls. Another element of the 355th flying lower and slightly east had just been jumped out of the clouds. Focke-Wulf 190s. Fast, precise, merciless. One Mustang went down almost instantly. Another followed seconds later. A third disappeared into the gray overcast, never seen rejoining formation. June 7, 1944. D-Day +1 would become the deadliest day of the war for the 355th Fighter Group in terms of pilot losses. Not over Berlin, not deep in Germany, over France, while supporting the invasion meant to end it all. When Ed finally turned his Mustang back toward England, the channel below looked calm, deceptively calm. The kind of blue that made it hard to believe men were dying by the thousands just miles away. Inside his cockpit, there was no calm. He had led the dive. He had dropped the first bomb. He had pulled out clean. Foster hadn't. Back at Steeple Morden, engines shut down one by one. Ground crews counted returning aircraft, fewer than they had launched. Empty revetments are louder than explosions. That night, the mood across the field was heavy. No speeches, no heroics, just quiet understanding. The Allies were pushing inland. The beachhead was holding. Strategically, it was working. But war does not measure victory in maps. It measures it in empty bunks, in unopened letters, in parents who will never understand how a son vanished in a French field beneath low gray clouds. Thomas J. Foster was an only child, no brothers, no sisters. With his death, his family line ended. History remembers June 6th as triumph. But for the men of the 355th, June 7th carried a different memory. And for Ed McNabb, every dive after that carried a ghost on his wing. And yet the war kept moving forward. By mid-June, the headlines would call it a breakthrough. The beachhead had held. Allied armor was pushing inland. The beginning of the end for Nazi Germany had started on those blood-soaked sands. But history books rarely mention the men who flew low enough to see the fear in a soldier's eyes. Ed McNabb kept flying. Every mission after June 7th carried a different weight. The roar of the Merlin engine no longer sounded like pure power. It sounded like responsibility. He had survived fire in his wing. He had watched a 20-year-old wingman vanish in a column of smoke. And still the orders came. Start engines. Form up. Roll in. Low-level attack work didn't get easier with experience. If anything, it got heavier. Every dive meant trusting the math, trusting the spacing, trusting the man behind you not to drift 1 second too long on the trigger. But trust in war is fragile. Somewhere over France, supply lines were shattered. Bridges collapsed. Convoys burned. On the ground, Allied soldiers advanced mile by mile, never knowing the names of the pilots who had cleared the road ahead. That was the nature of it. The infantry saw hedgerows and machine gun nests. The fighter pilots saw smoke flashes and seconds. And then the war moved on. Years later, Ed would still remember the details: cloud, layers stacked at 800 feet, the glow of naval guns through the overcast, the way a Mustang shuddered in a hard pullout. Memory doesn't fade evenly. It preserves the sharp edges. Thomas Foster never came home to Mississippi. His parents never saw grandchildren. A family name ended in a French field. This is the cost of air support that wins invasions. Not glory, not headlines. Just young men, aluminum wings, and moments where one decision separates survival from smoke. And as long as men like Ed lived to tell it, the sky over Normandy would never truly be silent. And maybe that is the final truth of D-Day. Not just the thunder of battleships, not just the flags rising over captured ground, but the thin aluminum skin of a Mustang diving through broken clouds, carrying the weight of an invasion on its wings. For every photograph of soldiers charging ashore, there were pilots above them flying blind through flak and smoke, trying to carve open a path with bombs and .50 caliber fire. They didn't see the faces on the beaches. They saw coordinates, rail lines, convoys moving west. They saw targets, but when the smoke cleared, what remained were names. Ed McNabb survived the summer of 1944. He flew more missions, watched the front line crawl across France and into Germany. The war that had nearly burned through his wing would eventually burn itself out in Europe. But survival is not the same as escape. Because long after the engines went silent, long after the invasion stripes were painted over, long after the newspapers declared victory, there were still memories. The thud in his wing, the flash in the sky behind him, the sight of a Mustang rolling toward the earth with no chance to recover. History remembers June 6th as triumph. The men who flew it remember June 7th too. And somewhere in Normandy, soil lies the wreckage of a 20-year-old pilot who followed his leader into a dive and never pulled out. That is the story behind the steel. That is the human cost behind the headline. And as long as we tell it, Thomas Foster is not just a casualty line in a report. He is a wingman who never made it home. And this is where most war stories fade out. With victory, with maps turning blue, with headlines announcing liberation. But the real ending is quieter than that. After the explosions, after the briefings, after the missing man formations, the airfields in England slowly returned to something almost normal. New pilots arrived. Replacement aircraft rolled in. The war machine kept turning forward, efficient and relentless. But empty bunks don't get replaced. Not really. Somewhere in Mississippi, a telegram arrived at a front door. A folded flag. A sentence beginning with, "The Secretary of War regrets to inform you, Thomas J." Foster became a line in an official report. Killed in action, June 7th, 1944. No mention of the low cloud ceiling. No mention of the shock wave from a 500-pound bomb. No mention of the split-second timing that separates life from impact. Just ink on paper. Ed McNabb would carry something different. He carried the memory of a young wingman tucked in tight behind him. The brief laugh about friendly fire the day before. The sound of a Merlin engine screaming in a dive. And the sight burned forever into his mind of a Mustang rolling over toward the earth. War reduces everything to seconds. Seconds in a dive. Seconds in a trigger squeeze. Seconds between pulling out or not. D-Day was a turning point in history. But history is built on individuals, on 20-year-old pilots who believed they were invincible until physics proved otherwise. The beaches were secured. France would be liberated. The war would move east. But somewhere beneath the soil of Normandy lies a reminder that victory always asks for payment. And sometimes it asks for everything. That is the story behind the aluminum wings. And if this story feels heavy, it should. Because behind every mission report, behind every confirmed target destroyed, there are threads that don't show up on a map. Thomas Foster wasn't just a pilot in the 355th Fighter Group. He was an only son, no brothers, no sisters. When his Mustang struck the earth on June 7, 1944, it wasn't just an aircraft that was lost. A family line ended in that explosion. Somewhere back home, two parents would grow old without grandchildren. No one to carry the name forward. No one to retell stories at a dinner table decades later. War doesn't just take lives. Sometimes it erases futures. For Ed McNabb's survival meant something complicated. He would fly again, lead again. Watch the Allied lines push deeper into France through hedgerows and into history books. The invasion that cost so much would ultimately succeed. But victory has layers. On the surface, liberation. Underneath, memory. He would remember the glow of naval guns through morning clouds, the violent jolt of a bullet striking his wing, the fire that almost consumed him, and the young lieutenant who trusted him enough to follow into a dive. That's the part numbers can't capture. D-Day is remembered as the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany. But for the men in those cockpits, it was also the beginning of ghosts that would fly beside them for the rest of their lives. This is not just a story about a Mustang, not just about bombs and flak. It's about responsibility, about leadership under pressure, about how 1 second in a dive can echo across generations. Because steel can be rebuilt, runways can be repaired, wars can be won. But some losses are permanent. And as long as we keep telling their stories, they are more than casualty numbers. They are sons, wingmen, and young Americans who never came home. And in the end, that may be the only thing that truly defeats time. Not machines, not medals, not even victory, but memory. The P-51 Mustangs of the 355th eventually flew on toward Germany. The black and white invasion stripes were painted over. The airfields in England grew quiet. The war that had once filled the sky with fire slowly burned itself out. But stories like this never really end. Because somewhere in an old logbook, the ink still marks June 6th and June 7th. Escort missions, dive bombing, aircraft lost, pilot killed in action. Cold words on a page. Yet behind those words were trembling hands on a throttle, sweat inside a cockpit at 20,000 feet. A young lieutenant lining up on a train, trusting his leader, trusting his training, trusting that he would pull out in time. History celebrates D-Day as triumph. And it was. The beachhead held. The Allies broke through. Europe would be freed. But freedom was not delivered by strategy alone. It was delivered by men who dove through low clouds into flak bursts and machine gun fire so soldiers on the ground could take one more step inland. Ed McNabb survived to tell the story. Thomas Foster did not. That is the balance of war. One man carries the memory. One becomes the memory. And every time we speak their names, every time we look past the headlines and into the cockpit, we honor something greater than victory. We honor sacrifice. Because behind every aluminum wing that roared over Normandy, there was a human heartbeat. And on June 7, 1944, one of those heartbeats stopped so the invasion could move forward. And then years later came the part no one expects. Not over France, not in the sky, in silence. Decades after the war, when the engines had long gone quiet, someone uncovered the detail that changes everything. Thomas J. Foster wasn't just a young pilot killed in action. He was the last of his name. No brothers, no sisters, no uncles with children. When his Mustang struck the ground in that violent roll on June 7, 1944, his entire family line ended with him. Think about that. All the training, all the courage, all the risks taken to secure a beachhead. And somewhere in Mississippi, a bloodline that had taken generations to build stopped in a single second of overpressure and flame. We talk about shockwaves in terms of bombs, but the real shockwave traveled across an ocean. It reached a farmhouse front door, a kitchen table, two parents reading a telegram that didn't explain the dive angle or the explosion or the low cloud ceiling. It simply said, "Killed in action." Here's the twist. No one prepares you for the invasion succeeded. France was liberated. Germany fell. History calls it one of the greatest military operations ever executed. But victory didn't restore that family name. It didn't give Ed back his wingman. And it didn't rewind the split second in a dive when a young pilot followed just a little too close. We often think of war in terms of momentum, armies advancing, front lines shifting. But sometimes the most permanent movement is the one that stops. An engine that never starts again. A letter that never gets written. A future that never happens. That is the quiet reversal hidden inside D-Day. The day that moved the world forward also ended entire worlds no one ever saw. But just when you think this story ends over Normandy, it doesn't. Because months after D-Day, after the hedgerows, after the breakout from France, Ed McNabb would face something even more terrifying than flak. Not a German fighter, not a burning wing, a decision. By late 1944, the skies over Europe were no longer just contested, they were desperate. The Luftwaffe, battered but not broken, began throwing everything it had left into the air. Young German pilots, veteran aces, last-ditch attacks against Allied bombers pushing deeper into the Reich. And one morning, high above Germany, Ed would spot a lone fighter climbing toward his formation. Not diving, not attacking from advantage, climbing straight into impossible odds. What happened next would stay with him long after the war ended, because in that moment, through the blur of a gun sight, he would see something he didn't expect. Not an enemy, a boy, a pilot no older than Thomas Foster. The trigger squeezed, the sky erupted again. But this time, the story would not end in Normandy fields, it would fall somewhere deep inside Germany. And what Ed discovered after that engagement about the pilot he shot down would open a chapter no one in his squadron saw coming. Because sometimes war doesn't just take lives. Sometimes it ties them together in ways history never planned. And that next encounter would change how he remembered D-Day forever. And yet this story does not end in smoke. Because decades later, something remarkable happened. Ed McNabb did what so many veterans struggled to do. He talked. He opened the logbooks. He described the clouds over Normandy, the glow of naval guns, the fire in his wing, the young lieutenant who followed him into a dive. And because he spoke, Thomas Foster was no longer just a casualty number in a 1944 report. He became a story again. Students listened, historians recorded. Families learned the names of men who had once been only ink on paper. The aluminum wings may have rusted, but the memory did not. And here's the part that feels almost like redemption: the invasion succeeded. The beachhead held. The war in Europe ended less than a year later. Millions who might have grown up under tyranny instead grew up in freedom. Cities were rebuilt. Families started anew. Children were born into a world that had been paid for by young men in cockpits over France. Thomas Foster never came home, but because of what he helped secure, countless others did. Ed lived long enough to see that world, to see peace, to see history. Remember D-Day not just as chaos, but as courage. And maybe that is the hopeful truth hidden inside even the darkest war story. Some sacrifices echo forward, not in headlines, not in medals, but in free skies.